Okay, we're live. Welcome to our first edition of Restoration Conversations. I'm Linda Falcone, and I'm really happy to welcome Letizia Treves, who is the Sassoon curator of later Italian paintings at the National Gallery in London. And on behalf of Advancing Women Artists and the Florentine, I really want to welcome you. We're so excited to have you here for our fireside chat. And I know that our friends and supporters all over the world are really looking forward to hearing your insight on the show Artemisia, which obviously you curated. And we have people from all over the world. We have people who are tuning in at dawn and at dusk and in the middle of the night, and who are in their pajamas because they're having their morning coffee in Hawaii. So it's very exciting to have this opportunity to speak with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted.
I actually wanted to start by saying, because I'm sure we have some new friends as well who have tuned in. And I wanted to start by saying that we've been waiting for your show for many years at Advancing Women Artists, and to share a memory with you in 2008 when AWA began its restoration of Artemisia's David and Bathsheba for the Pitti Palace. I remember going into the restoration studio and seeing all of these missing spots and seeing the stucco work covering up pieces of her painting. And I thought to myself, she's missing pieces. Artemisia's missing pieces. And 12 years later, I feel like your show plays a role in the sense that it is helping fill in the missing pieces of Artemisia. So I really congratulate you on it. It's been very well received, as we know. But many of us, unfortunately, are heartbroken because we won't be able to see it in person. So I wanted to ask you if you would start by giving us a general overview of the show and also telling us how it came about for you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. No, I'm delighted. And I'm very aware that a lot of people tuning in tonight are not going to be able to travel to London to see it. So I've tried to include as many shots of the installation as possible. So the show really came about in 2018 when the National Gallery acquired our self-portrait of St. Catherine of Alexandria, and it's the first picture by Artemisia to enter a public collection in the UK. So the idea for a show came about then. So I really had about 16 months to put it together. And, as I'm sure you all know, there's been an increasing interest in Artemisia in the last sort of 20 years or so with various exhibitions in the US and in Europe. But this is the very first show in the UK, which is also quite surprising given that she worked in London. And I suppose I really approached it thinking, well, what do I want to do with this show that might be a bit different? And for me, it was really, in a nutshell, it was about choosing the best works by her. So really presenting the best of the best and really sort of going back to kind of the core of documented, signed works, because there've been an increasing number of attributions in recent years, sort of going back to basics in a way and present as pure a sort of story as possible. But also for me, it was fundamental to bring out her personality. And you can see here in the foyer of the exhibition, in a nutshell, I want to show what a woman can do. So before you even walk in, you get a sense of where I'm going with the exhibition. And it was very much this idea of showing Artemisia not only sort of as a great painter, but also slightly more fully in the round as a person. And so her words punctuate the show at various points and begin in this first room where, you can see the transcript of the rape trial is between Artemisia's very first known painting and a picture by Orazio, which he painted whilst she was training in his studio. And for me, that's sort of where her story really begins, but she is sort of her voice comes through. And so I think there's a real sense of her as a woman. And really it's a balance of very famous pictures with also some sort of lesser known things. So there's sort of something for everyone, I hope.
That's interesting. It's exciting to see the first image of the show, almost as if we're entering into Artemisia's world a little bit at a time. I'm wondering, because one of the first segments of the show, and certainly a segment that's very relevant to us, is becoming Artemisia in Florence. And I wanted to ask you particularly about this segment because so many of us have become ourselves in Florence. Obviously, being based in Florence, we look at things from a Florentine perspective first and foremost. And if you think about Artemisia and the fact that she was the first woman ever accepted at the Academy of Drawing, if you think that she gave birth to 5 children in this period, and that she became really a professional artist in her own right. And it happened in Florence. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this segment of the show and your outlook.
Sure. I mean, the phrase "becoming Artemisia" was actually rather brilliantly coined by Keith Christensen in an article in 2004 following the great show at Met in St. Louis and then in Rome. And I mean, it is precisely that. Florence is the city in which Artemisia really develops into the artist that she will become. So this is the Orazio in the first room of the exhibition. And as you can see, as you transition from the first to the second room through the doorway, you can see Artemisia's sort of highly sort of original reworking of Orazio's composition. And that in a nutshell shows, you know, she leaves the studio and then sets out on her own. And for me, that was a very important sort of link visually to make for people as they step into the second room, which, as you say, is called Becoming Artemisia in Florence. And I mean, what better thing to have in Florence than these great pictures that are in the Uffizi and the Pitti, and of course the other Judith from Capodimonte. So I felt that this room, it was really about letting the power of her works speak. So you can see it's not a very crowded room. You know, they're so powerful, her pictures, partly also because the figures are life-size. I really wanted to let the paintings do the talking. And for me, this pairing of the two Judiths, it's what everyone hopes and expects for in an exhibition on Artemisia. But I mean, it is really, really powerful. And, you know, very eloquently shows how she took her art in a very sort of different direction as she stepped out of Orazio's studio. And in this room, you just have paintings by Artemisia. So in no sense do you get, you know, nothing sort of dilutes the power of her paintings. And I really wanted that to be very strong in that second room. And the other half of the room is this wonderful lineup of her self-portraits. I wanted people to sort of come face to face with her. And of course, our painting, which is the one in the dark frame, is nestled here between the Hartford self-portrait as a lute player and the Uffizi St. Catherine for the very first time, because our picture obviously was only discovered in 2017. And, you know, I've thought a lot about Artemisia representing herself in her pictures, obviously with the acquisition of our self-portrait. And I felt in this room it was very important because you know, we're not sure why she used her image a lot at this point. Is it really, you know, obviously it could have been her own choice. I mean, there are obviously practical consideration. It's a lot cheaper, a lot easier just to look at yourself in a mirror than it is to hire models.
You can say that again. My gosh.
Well, she complains about that in her letters later in life. You know, she says, you know, these so hard to find good ones, and they're a complete headache when you do, and then they cost so much money. But it was often, I think, also at a patron's sort of request, you know, and I think, you know, the part that patrons play in Artemisia's subjects and so on has been underplayed in the past. We mustn't forget that she didn't just do these things on a whim. It may have been sort of asked of her. But there's no question that for her, it's also a kind of way to market herself, you know, like Rembrandt does in the Netherlands. So I felt this was a very kind of eloquent way that you come face to face with her and you really see how she reinvents herself in different guises.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important because sometimes we underestimate, particularly for women artists and early women artists, how important marketing was. They were master marketers, and they were diplomats. They were often ladies in waiting of royalty, etc. And Artemisia herself was working in the court, in the Medici court in Florence, for example, and so that sort of leads into a question I have about Artemisia using her own portrait in her paintings, because she depicts herself as the lute player, as the female martyr. She depicts herself as Saint Catherine of Alexandria, for example. I mean, these are very sort of high, philosophically high or historically high positions, and you see Artemisia, you know, as both maker and muse, which is something that obviously her male contemporaries couldn't do. I mean, so she had sort of one up on her male contemporaries, and I think that that was probably attractive for her patrons. I mean, what's your view on this?
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, the marketing of herself is something that, you know, the sort of business side of her art has also sometimes been underplayed. But I think the idea of marketing herself was very important. And so actually in the exhibition here, as you approach in the second room, you can see the self-portraits all in a line, but through the doorway, you see Simon Vouet's portrait of Artemisia, which is very sort of artfully contrived. But I love that juxtaposition because you sort of get a sense of how Artemisia saw herself and how other artists also saw her. This privileged position that you talk about, absolutely. In fact, the next room is dedicated very much to this idea. So it's called the Hand of the Famed Artemisia, because when she returns to Rome, she's, you know, she comes back really a celebrity. And so I think patrons were fascinated by her, by this very kind of singular position as a successful woman artist, particularly in Rome. And so not only do they want pictures by her hand, but they actually start commissioning, you know, portraits of her. And there's this beautiful drawing by Dumonstier of her hand, a sort of portrait drawing of Artemisia's right hand, and as well as the medal and the engraving. And I think, you know, her fame is something that she also exploited in her own art, but here it's very eloquent through these objects in different media. And of course, she herself uses the fact of being both artist and subject, or muse and maker, as you said, in her, you know, famous self-portrait as allegory of painting, which I don't believe is a self-portrait, but is an image of painting you're definitely meant to associate with Artemisia herself. I think she really did offer a different perspective to the sort of well-known subjects. And I think in this way, clients knew they would get something different from Artemisia. So in fact, one of the best rooms is pictures from the 1620s, where she returns to these heroic sort of female protagonists. And this room is called The Female Hero, very much, you know, a nod to Mary Garrard's great book on Artemisia. And it's in here that you see her sort of tackling those biblical subjects and turning fresh to them every time. And, you know, I think she knew that she'd sort of built her success on these subjects, and patrons knew they would get something different from her when she painted these subjects. And on the other side of the room, you have these paintings, and I think there definitely was a sort of additional appeal for a collector to own a picture, you know, with female protagonists that was, you know, sensual or erotic or violent, that was also painted by women. You know, these would have sort of caused a sort of added titillation because of it. And it was something she was absolutely well aware of, and you know, sort of capitalized on it.
The painting that is on, let's see, if we go back to the slide, the painting that's the Magdalene, it's a new attribution. It's a very sort of original painting of the Magdalene.
It is. So that's another one of the sort of relatively new things, in the sense it was discovered in 2014. It's actually been in an exhibition on Caravaggesque and, well, Roman art and sculpture in Amsterdam. But it's not been seen alongside other Artemisias before. So this is great to have it here. But actually look at that wall, just how different these pictures are, you know.
Yes.
And it's something that I knew before hanging the show, obviously writing on the catalogue, but even, you know, actually in the show even now. I mean, it is puzzling how she can change her mode of painting. I mean, perhaps we'll talk about it again later when we talk about the Susannas, but they're just highly original as well in the way she approaches these subjects. And I think it's particularly true when you see the subjects she returns to again and again. Every time she's thinking completely fresh about how to approach her subject.
Yeah, also because you can see a progression, even a psychological progression in her works. I wanted to ask, I'm definitely a word person. I see things from the word perspective, and it's often frustrating when you're researching early women artists, because it really is a lack of their voice. Oftentimes we don't have words from their hand, etc. So I was fascinated to see that in the show you've included the rape trial, you've included her love letters to her lover, Francesco Maria Maringhi, which is also really exciting. We can see what she's thinking, what she's feeling, how she's expressing herself, etc. So I want to hear from you how including these documents and these archival treasures help you or have helped you present Artemisia in the round, because I think that goal is so important. I mean, sometimes we get stuck in looking at a painter a certain way, and particularly for Artemisia, who, as you're saying, is so varied. How do these documents help flesh her out?
Yeah, I mean, the letters I knew quite early on. I wanted to borrow them because they're relatively new. You know, they're only found in 2011. But it's what you say. I mean, it's so remarkable to be able to hear her voice or read her voice, as it were, 400 years on. And I think for her, she's sort of, I mean, I probably started crying when I saw the letters for the first time and the trial, because it just, you know, she's a real person, you know, because particularly for people who've worked on her for such a long time, and I've only really kind of worked intensely on Artemisia for a sort of couple of years, but she's become this sort of iconic figure, sort of, you know, a feminist icon as well, and someone who's sort of championed for her resilience. But, you know, when you read her letters, you know, she feels all these emotions that we feel, and she feels very, very real. And that for me was something I really wanted to bring out in the show. And, you know, as I showed, the quotes from her later letters are wonderful, you know, talking about, you know, I will show your illustrious lordship what a woman can do. And one of the Naples rooms is called, you know, the spirit of Caesar in the soul of a woman, another famous quote. So her words punctuate the show. And in this slide, if you don't mind just bringing up this. So in this slide, this is actually the letters she writes to Maringhi, which, you know, we have to remember, very intimate letters. And obviously no one was ever meant to read these other than Maringhi. And I wanted to kind of try and recreate that sense of intimacy. And the letters almost look like they're floating. So you almost feel like you can pick them up. And I worked very hard with the designer to try and come up with a way to sort of create that kind of almost quite dreamy quality about them. So the quotes sort of that you see on the wall, they're almost like sort of thoughts, you know, also because her letters are written in this sort of stream of consciousness. And it was very hard to choose, actually, which letters to borrow, because there are about 36 letters that were found in the Archivio Frescobaldi in 2011 by Francesco Solinas. And so I read them thoroughly many times over. But what I really wanted to bring through was sort of try and go against those preconceptions people had of Artemisia as a sort of victim, and because I think she really comes across as very kind of forceful in these letters. So one is extremely passionate, very erotic. Another's very, very funny. One, I chose the letter she writes when her little boy dies, because I think, you know, that aspect of her being a mother who lost 4 out of her 5 children, I wanted to bring that out. And I think you get a real sense of her through these letters. We also should mention, we got the letters restored prior to the exhibition. And here's a lovely detail of one of them. I mean, they're so legible, and her handwriting is, I mean, people who look at these letters can't believe they're 400 years old, you know, there's something very, very special about seeing her handwriting. And then, of course, the trial transcript, because the episode of her rape is so well known and referred to all the time. And I felt it was something we needed to address, but I really didn't want to sensationalize it. And I didn't really want that to be the focus of the first room, where I knew we'd have these great pictures. So actually, we had decided to borrow it very late in the day, which is why the transcript doesn't appear in the catalogue. And we asked it, I genuinely didn't think they could ever lend it. So in January, we asked the archive, and you know, they agreed to it. So in fact, we had the whole volume digitized prior to it being lent, because this had never been done. And for me, it's just, look at it, it's such an amazing object. But seeing it as a sort of legal, you know, a collection of legal letters and documents made it feel quite sort of contextualized, you know, in a kind of historical way, which is what I wanted to do. And I chose to open the volume up at the scene where she's brought to Tassi in the Torre di Nonna prison, and she's tortured with the Sibille. And the reason I chose that is because her voice, this is actually a professional photograph of the page where it's open, it's because her voice is so strong there, and you get a sense of her being very compliant, very poised, answering the judge's questions, you know, and it's when she famously says, "È vero, è vero, è vero." But you also get her spirit, about, I think you can see it with my pointer, so about halfway down, she turns to Tassi and says, questo è l'anello che tu mi dai, e queste sono le promesse. So this is the ring that you've given me, and these are your promises. So of course she's referring to the fact that he promised to marry her. And I love that. You get a real sense of her spirit, her fire, even aged 18 in this incredibly difficult situation. So I think it really vividly brings her to life without sort of over-sensationalizing, if you like.
Letizia, I'm really surprised how long the document is. I mean, it's...
Well, there are lots of other trials in there. So that's the other thing, this whole volume is the 1612, it's volume 104 of, hundreds and hundreds of other volumes. So and that also is important, because I think you get a real sense of, Artemisia is just one of many, many girls who went through this. And what's so exceptional is that we know who this girl is,
But were there similar cases?
Yes, Elizabeth Cohen's done a lot of work on these rape trials of young virgins in Rome at the very beginning of the 17th century. She wrote very eloquently, actually, about how Artemisia's trial follows a sort of, not a formula, but there was definitely a way that you would present yourself in the trial. So it begins with a physical examination, you making your statement, then you have to establish the girl's reputation that she really was a virgin. And, and in a way, seeing it in that context, you realize Artemisia's was no different from every other girl who'd gone through the same thing.
That's fascinating. For me, absolutely new news. I've never heard of it or thought of it. I think the idea of the relationship is so important. I mean, how you're saying you can see her, you can feel her, and to have the writing reflect some of the strength and power and drama that you see in the paintings as well is just fascinating, to be able to make this combination, this connection or merger between visual art and the written word. Sincerest congratulations for that.
Oh, thank you.
It's really so important and sometimes underestimated, how powerful it can be to reiterate the power of her character in two ways. I think, from the perspective of advancing women artists, we work to create a connection between female artists of the past and women today, art lovers today. And really, we always sort of start from a point of view of paintings are living entities. They get old, they get hurt, they have their own dignity, they have their own identity. And when you're restoring a painting and following it through various processes, you also create a relationship with the artist. And I was struck by the fact that in one of your press interviews, you said, I've lived with Artemisia for 2 years or more, right? And
as have my children, yes.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, what was it like to have Artemisia as a roommate? And, what has she given you, or what has she taught you as a curator and as a woman, and what have you given her, in the sense, what gift did you bring to Artemisia via this show?
I mean, it's interesting what you say about the physical, the idea of pictures going through, sort of physical stress, if you like, because I think for me, it really began with the acquisition, actually. The exhibition came out of the acquisition. So for me, the story really began in end of 2017, early 2018. And sorry, if you can bring up the slide of our painting. So it was really with the acquisition of our picture and then the conservation of our picture. So as you said, it's that kind of physical proximity to the object, understanding the object. And all the while Larry Keith, our head of conservation, was working on the picture, I was sort of, really intensely sort of reading Artemisia's letters, reading up on her, really. Because, you have to remember, Artemisia is only one artist of many that I look after in the National Gallery. So, and it's daunting when there have been people who spent their whole lives, like Mary Garrard, or, who really spent a very long time thinking about this artist and having to sort of catch up. But so for me, the exhibition sort of in a way was it sort of came full circle. It was a whole journey. For me, the acquisition was really important because it was about adding sort of a permanent presence in the national collection and the first picture by her entering a public collection. And when we announced the acquisition, I mean, the mass kind of hysteria, not just in the media, but the public and staff as well, even within the National Gallery, the excitement of having a picture by her and her story. And while we were restoring the painting, we actually put out these fortnightly short films tracking the conservation almost in real time. And you got such a sense of mounting excitement. People couldn't wait to see this picture go on the wall. And so it was also during that time that our director decided we should do something quite different with this picture. I don't know, maybe we'll come back to that later, but the picture went on a really unusual tour around the UK. We decided to take the picture out to people rather than expect people to come and see it in Trafalgar Square. And that was really an outreach program. And it's because Artemisia's got such an inspiring story. And I think people find her art very powerful, but also you don't have to be an art historian to get her paintings. And I think that is a really important point. And as a curator, I really thought about that for the show. And so I'm obviously thrilled if people read my labels, but actually you can see what I'm trying to do by the way I show the pictures next to each other, the pairings, or the, I want people to also have a kind of visual impact. So I really got to know her as a painter, but also as a woman reading her letters. And for me, I suppose, well, as a woman and as a mother, as a working mother, I have 3 children, I just have so much admiration for her determination, for her hard work. And this really comes out through reading her letters over and over and over again. What I gave to her, I don't know. I hope I've done her proud. I think I've done her proud. I mean, I think presenting the best work of an artist, I felt it was really important to give the British public sort of the best of the best. And I think there's no question also with the fact that the show's been received with such incredible reviews. I think people either asking themselves, why have we never heard of her? I mean, she really wasn't a household name in England until the show. But I think for me, it's about really letting her, showing people that she absolutely deserves a place as being one of the greatest artists of the Italian Baroque and an artist in her own right, sort of separate from her father, her own identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important when you're talking about process, to allow the public to see the painting, to see it in all of its stages. And even the non-art historian public, etc. Because I mean, some people don't relate to art on the wall immediately, but everybody relates to making something new, or to renewing, restoring original dignity to a piece. So I think it's amazing to be able to see the best of the best all in one place. The question of why hasn't the world seen her before, or why hasn't the British public seen her before, is a question that could take up 45 minutes just with that question.
Well, I think the world has seen her before. I mean, I have to say most of the pictures, apart from the sort of newly discovered, were in the great 2001 show at the Met and then St. Louis and Rome. But that was very much Orazio and Artemisia. And I think a lot of the reaction of that was, well, he's the better painter, right? He's technically the better painter. And obviously Orazio is so important to Artemisia. It's why he has a presence at the beginning and at the end of the show here, but particularly for London. But it's interesting, a lot of the pictures are the same. The sort of famous one, you see the Detroit painting. I mean, a lot of the pictures were in that show.
Yeah, they're responding to each other oftentimes too.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because a lot of attention has been given, obviously, to the several Judiths that Artemisia painted and the beheading scene. But I'm really interested in Susanna because, it's her first painting, it's her last painting. It's in the middle. She also talks about this theme. And I was reading the catalog, and there's an essay by Elizabeth Cropper, and she says, initially Susanna is, she's looking with fear at these lascivious men. In the second painting, the middle painting, she's praying. And in the third painting, she's dismissing them, with her hand raised. And so I wanted to ask you to tell us about this trio and about Susanna and what it brings to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are the three, as it were. So yes, I mean, we're lucky that her first and last known pictures are the same subject, and also the painting from the kind of height of her career in the 20s, and all three pictures are in the exhibition. And I'm thrilled that they are, because you get exactly what you've just said, such a range of expression. And for me, this is so eloquent in showing that she turns afresh to these subjects every time, and sort of rethinks them in a very sort of fresh way. So the picture of 1610, you know, for me is very much about the kind of physical rejection of the elders, and that the way they're sort of, you know, really invading her space. There's the kind of physical threat. The picture she paints in the 1620s is much more about the kind of modesty of Susanna. And then the last one is this sort of very theatrical dismissal of the elders. And I mean, I have to say, if these pictures were not all signed and dated, you would really struggle to believe that they were by the same artist. And that's, you know, sort of leads me on to one of the things that I think Keith Christensen first coined, this idea that she was a chameleon. And it, you know, there's been such a backlash against that. But you look at these three pictures and she absolutely changes her style. And I don't see that as a negative. I actually see it very much as a sort of sign of her business acumen. And she could adapt her style according to the wishes and desires of her patrons in the cities in which she worked. And so, you know, the picture of the 1620s is attuned to, you know, Bolognese patrons in Rome, you know, because the young Guercino's just arrived, there's a new Bolognese pope, and there she's inserting a sort of Bolognese landscape. You know, I mean, to me, it speaks much more of her being in tune with what people want and being in tune with what her patrons wish. And I think they just so, you know, they show such a range of emotions, you know. And I think this is really because she brings to it this kind of lived experience of being a woman. She can imagine what it was like for Susanna, and brings that into her pictures.
Yeah, it really is amazing. There's such different views. I'm trying to look up close. Now, the first one was painted when she was in her teens, no?
Yeah, so it's 1610, so she could be 16 or 17. Yeah, and then the last, which is 1652, she's almost 60. I mean, we're very lucky in a way that they span her entire career.
Yeah.
And then the one from 1652 is almost certainly a collaboration with another artist, Onofrio Palumbo, because they receive a joint payment in January 1653 for a painting of Susanna that's sold. So, you know, it's that in itself is quite interesting, because you have to view this painting in that context of being in Naples and working with other artists. And so.
Right. And now that's the Bologna painting, correct?
Yes, that's correct. It was only really, it was thought to be by Serrani. It was in the basement. It's very damaged, but was really only reattributed by Adelina Modesti in 2008. So again, you know, it hasn't been widely seen in this context either.
I actually, Letizia, I got the phone call. Adelina called me when she found it, and she said she was shining a light, you know, in the bottom corner, and she said, Linda, I come and see the painting in the deposits in Bologna. And so Jane Fortune, AWA's founder, and I went to see the painting.
Wonderful.
It was amazing, also because you realize that art history is a very also mobile study. You know, that there are constantly, we think of museums as static places, but in reality, there's so much to discover, and particularly for women artists, you know, there are, as I said at the beginning, pieces missing, you know, of her body of works, etc. So it's exciting when the dialogue starts, and then, you know, people start considering pictures and thinking about her hand and her, she confuses everyone, you know, because she has very different style, etc. But I think, you know, I agree with you when you say it's a strength. I mean, I think that her ability to respond to the needs of her client, or the desires and tastes, etc., also tells us about the tastes of the time, too. I think another thing I wanted to ask you is, we are seeing Artemisia, well, certainly for the British public, seeing Artemisia, quote unquote, for the first time, and also it's interesting because there's so many powerful women in this exhibition, the hero, the anti-hero, etc. And Artemisia is not painting usually devotional pieces. She's not painting. She's not getting commissioned by churches, etc. Usually, so she really paints in the thick of it, in the sense you see betrayal and violence and ecstasy and death, and sometimes theater, definitely fashion. I mean, you see many things. So what can you tell us about Artemisia's women?
I mean, there is a room, as I said, dedicated to the kind of female hero, which kind of drills a bit deeper into her portrayal of women and sort of why that set her apart from other artists, why collectors turn to her. But I think actually it's from the pictures that she paints in Naples also, where you see her taking on subjects that I think are quite interesting from that perspective of painting women. Because her work really does encompass quite a range of female protagonists. And for me, one of the most beautiful pictures in the show is this Lot and his daughters in Toledo. And it's the thought of, how does Artemisia tackle this subject in which the women are basically the perpetrators of incest, the instigators of incest. It's often shown as a sort of scene of seduction, obviously of incest, it's often erotic, but here she does it so sensitively. The girls are dressed and they're sort of gently coaxing their father to drink, and I find that so interesting that she manages to approach this sort of subject where, thinking about how to represent the women in a sort of decorous way. And it's full of kind of real subtlety and gentleness, this picture. And again, I think as a woman painting it, I think she brings something different. Similarly here, I'm showing you the naming of John the Baptist, which was painted for Philip IV. And, this is actually all about the midwives. Again, she sort of, I wonder if this subject was given to her because it was about the birth of the Baptist and they thought that was a sort of suitable subject for a woman to paint as opposed to the execution of the Baptist or the preaching of the Baptist. But she does treat it in a very kind of female way and focuses entirely on the midwives who are sort of tending to the infant. I love the one testing the water, another one bringing a bowl of water in this kind of chipped ceramic bowl. And the parents are completely relegated to the sides. And then next to it, you have her her only literary subject that we know of, and the sort of anti-heroine, and she brings a real sort of humor to this portrayal. So I think it naturally came out with the choice of pictures that are in the show, that you get a real range of heroines and of female protagonists. And, Cleo, which you can see here, the Muse of History, is, to me, not perhaps one of the most sort of visually powerful pictures in the show, partly because of its scale. Everything else in Naples is vast and, but it's such a powerful picture, this very kind of dignified image of sort of heroic womanhood with her sort of hand on her hip. And I love the fact that Artemisia signs herself into the kind of history books with this picture. She signs in the open book and just signs Artemisia. Actually, there's no Gentileschi, just Artemisia. And I love that. It's a sort of declaration, really. Sort of, don't forget me. She's writing herself into history. So yeah, for me, it's the sort of full range of Artemisia's women, which is most interesting. And she just really avoids stereotypes. That's the thing about her women.
Yeah, because there seems to be no sort of morality, or how can I put it, in the sense that she doesn't say, oh, I don't want to avoid that anti-heroine. The anti-heroine is painted with just as much dignity and power,
But I think we have to remember that the choice of subjects was almost certainly not hers. So, a patron would determine the subject, and then she had obviously some artistic license in how to interpret that. But I find that even more interesting because someone might go to her and say, paint Lot and his daughters, but they must have known they weren't going to get an erotic scene of a father being seduced by his daughters from Artemisia. So,
right. But there was a taste for it. I mean, there was
absolutely. Absolutely. And the fact that these Susanna, Patrizia Cavazzini's done a lot of work on these, on 17th century collections, and these pictures of Susanna and Bathsheba, they were often commissioned together. They're often displayed together alongside Venus. And, you'd have the sort of biblical with the mythological, all side by side in a sort of, chamber of erotica.
Interesting. I wanted to ask about about the hand of the famed Artemisia, and you showed us some images, of the medallion and various ways in which she was honored and acclaimed. And this is an interesting point as well, because sometimes we think that women artists were always sort of relegated, but many times they were successful in their time only to be then forgotten by history. So why was Artemisia forgotten? And on a point you made earlier, you actually called the show just Artemisia.
I did, yeah.
Not Artemisia Gentileschi. So why?
Well, that I'm delighted to say Mary Garrett complimented me on doing that, because you wouldn't believe the amount of public and press who have sort of criticized us for this and said, oh, you're only doing that because she's a woman. You're not using her surname, because they see it as a sort of denigrating thing. For me, it wasn't. It was a number of things. It's principally, Gentileschi is her father as well, so I didn't want any confusion there. She didn't always go by Gentileschi. I mean, in Florence, she's exclusively known as Lomi, so that was another reason. And then, as Mary pointed out in her sort of prologue, is that Artemisia's tomb was said to just say, "Haec Artemisia," here lies Artemisia. And I love the idea that she sort of doesn't belong to anyone. So the surname, in a way, it's not Stiattesi, the name of her husband, it's not Lomi, the name of her paternal grandfather, and it's not Gentileschi, the name of her father. And it was quite risky for us because, there isn't a huge amount of name recognition in the UK prior to this exhibition. But what helped a lot is after buying the picture, I think, and the tour she did around the UK was actually called Artemisia Visits. So we decided it then to just go with her first name, and I'm really glad we did. And, it's nothing to do with her being a woman. Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, they're all known by their first names. So, it was for all these sort of reasons. But so that room that's the sort of the hand of the famed Artemisia is very much looking at her celebrity in her own day. But you're quite right to sort of, this idea of her sort of the oblivion in a way that she'd suffered is something actually the press were really, really interested in. And in fact, in sort of various interviews, the thing that they sort of were fascinated by was this idea that she'd only really been kind of rediscovered in the 1970s. And if we could just have the next slide. These are two install shots from Brooklyn, where the great exhibition on women artists, Brooklyn was one of the various US venues, and you can see two of the pictures.
I'm sorry, Letizia, what date was it?
It opened in LA in 1976, and then traveled to several venues. And in Brooklyn, it was in 1977. And actually what's so interesting is, at this exhibition, really, it was a handful of works by Artemisia being brought to a kind of wider international public for the first time. And so it was really very important for her sort of wider kind of, an acknowledgement beyond sort of Italy, where she was known, but not to the heights of the fame which she enjoys today. But we also have to remember that the oblivion sort of suffered by Artemisia was also suffered by other Baroque artists. So, Caravaggio was only really rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century. Orazio probably in the 1950s. And, it took Artemisia another 20, 25 years. But it had a lot to do with changing tastes. And these kind of naturalistic artists working in the manner of Caravaggio were basically out of fashion for such a long time.
It's fascinating. I have one more question for you, except for before I ask it, I want to invite the public as well. I know we have a lot of people watching and a lot of curious people watching. So please, if you would like to ask a question to Letizia, we would love to receive your ideas and your comments, etc. So you can, in fact, chat with us. So after we finish, we'll open for questions. And I wanted to talk about the lead up to the show. You had mentioned Artemisia visiting places outside of the museum. I know that there was an all-girls school, there was a female prison, and this excitement of her going out to the public. And the National Gallery, from that point of view, was very avant-garde, and I really tip my hat to the work that you've done in popularizing her art as well, in the sense that we often think of museums as very static places, but on your point about Caravaggio, the public also plays a really big role in determining what is on show.
Yeah.
And that's very important for art by women, because when the public starts demanding and asking, where are the women? That's when we, curators are obviously going to respond to that on some level. So I'm interested in if you could talk to us a little bit about the lead up and how that then influenced, you just said it influenced your naming the show, but are there other ways where there was a connection between what was coming out on the outside and what you did then in the gallery?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, the public are everything. I mean, in a way, the whole point of having a museum is to preserve works of art for future generations to enjoy. And what's the point of an exhibition if you can't have a public? So obviously our public is much reduced at the moment because of COVID. So we're actually trying to find many ways to try and reach people with the exhibition in different ways. So we have a really exciting program of talks on Zoom and, so on. And, there's lots of ways you can engage people, particularly now after a few months where people have got used to doing quite a lot online. So I've done a virtual tour of the exhibition, which we'll be putting out as a Facebook Live, just to try and give people the opportunity to sort of visit virtually if they can't actually physically come to London. But the public's key. I think what I realized was doing the visits tour, and I have just a slide with some images from each of the places the picture went to. The idea was with this tour is not to reach sort of a maximum number of people. I think the director had a very clear directive. He said, you need to work out where we're going to take it, but this is about reaching people who would never normally walk into a museum. And so we sort of decided the kind of places we wanted to send it to, the kind of audiences we wanted to reach. And then the tour sort of took shape. So it opened on International Women's Day at Glasgow Women's Library, where, they very much championed her as a sort of feminist icon. But then it went to a kind of practicing GP surgery in Pocklington in the north of England, where the focus there was very much on art and well-being, and this drive by the government to have arts on prescription, and we worked with a charity called Paintings and Hospitals, so that once Artemisia left, Paintings and Hospitals will continue to rotate their collection of contemporary art in the spaces. And the idea was very much we didn't just want this picture to pop up for 3 days and then it was a lot of work. So, we wanted some sort of legacy. So Paintings and Hospitals was a wonderful thing to kind of come out of that. Then the picture went to HMP Send in Surrey, which is a women's prison. And there it was very much a kind of practical art workshop. And I wasn't allowed to go to that one. It was obviously very high security, but we did short films in each place. And this was really moving because there was one inmate who had never stood in front of a painting ever, had never even gone into a museum, and it was the first time they were sort of standing in front of an object that was sort of 400 years old. And then as the story of Artemisia's life unfolded and the picture, they just felt very inspired, and they created artworks in response. And another inmate who actually is serving a life sentence had been a visitor to the National Gallery before going to prison and never thought she would stand in front of a painting ever again. So for me, that was such a moving thing, the idea that you could, even if it was only 12 people for 3 days, it was a very meaningful engagement. And then the picture also went to the Sacred Heart Catholic High School in Newcastle. And I went up there and they ran a whole careers event for the girls. And here it was very much about, so the girls explored themes around self-identity, because obviously being a self-portrait, and the idea that you shouldn't be afraid to be who you want to be. And also the Sacred Heart schools around the world were set up by these two very pioneering women in the 19th century. So the idea of kind of women as a kind of who their role models were, who were their kind of female role models in their own lives. And this was a really moving thing as well, because it's a school in, not an affluent part of Newcastle. About 40% of the girls are actually in social care. So, these girls with very difficult, very different backgrounds. And in a way, it's quite a leveler. You're all standing in front of a work of art from 400 years ago and you're learning about someone's story, and it'll touch you all in very different ways. So what really affected me with this whole tour was how, as I said before, you don't need to be an art historian to appreciate Artemisia's paintings. They're incredibly powerful, and I think, you can have a very personal response to her art without having a sort of PhD. and just how inspiring she is. I think she's just a huge inspiration, both as a painter, as a woman, and for me that really sort of fed into what I wanted to come out, the sense of giving her a more sort of rounded personality in the show.
Yeah, it's very moving, and I think the fact that Artemisia, to me, first and foremost, was a storyteller. And
Definitely.
it's so heartwarming to see how many stories are being created around the show, around her art. This picture of the young students engaging with the painting. We have, I know, a class of Australian high school students who are watching us now, and it's actually in the middle of the night. So
oh wow,
thanks to them for joining in as well. But it's very. It's very fun. I'm looking at the comments now. We have different places in the world. So aloha from Hawaii, hello from Dublin, Philadelphia, Brazil, Zurich, California, Seattle, Paris, London.
That's great.
Duxbury, Massachusetts, and Rome, Chicago. Amazing. So it's very fun. And Montreal. There are all these hellos, New York City. So hello, Letizia, from all of these.
Hello, I'm so thrilled you're all joining from around the world
as well. So I'm let's see. I'm going down to get to the questions here. We have South Africa as well, Cape Town. Yeah, there's a question about the content. You had mentioned having some content, and is there the possibility of? You had mentioned that you would be filming the exhibition so that people could see it online, and how do people access these materials?
Sure. So we provide. So I did a live press, or rather filmed press tour, which was just for the press because obviously we couldn't hold the normal press conference. And then we had a film tour for the sponsors of the exhibition. That's sort of been made exclusive to members of the National Gallery, but the intention is absolutely to make that available to the public, and it will probably go out as a Facebook Live, I think probably next month. So do keep an eye on our social media channels. There's content, sort of static content online. So I wrote a piece on Artemisia through her words. On the website, as well as something about her heroines. But as I said, there's lots of conversations going on. We're hoping to get Gina Siciliano, who did a brilliant graphic novel on Artemisia, to do something, maybe a practical workshop. So there's lots that we're trying to program in, even just because we've realized there's so much demand and people are so excited about the show, and it's so frustrating people can't come from around the world. So yeah.
Goodness. We have someone asking about the letters. Can you tell us more about the discovery of the letters? This is from Fiona Richard in Portugal.
Sure.
More about the discovery of the letters. Where have they been for 400 years?
So these letters are in the Archivio Storico Frescobaldi, which still belongs to the Frescobaldi family in Florence. They were found because Francesco Maria Maringhi, with whom Artemisia began an affair in Florence, and the letters date from when the two were separated. So she'd returned to Rome and she was writing to him in Florence. And unfortunately, we don't have his letters to her, so we only have half the conversation. They were found amongst Maringhi's personal papers because Maringhi was in the service of the Frescobaldi. So it was in the Frescobaldi archives, but in Maringhi's personal papers. And I believe Francesco Solinas, who first published them in 2011 and made the discovery in a really very useful kind of critical edition, he's about to republish. I mean, I think it's 2020, so shortly, a second edition with more documents that he's found. So.
Interesting.
And
okay,
sorry, I should say that they're mainly by Artemisia, written to Maringhi, but there are a few by her husband as well, who was fully aware of the fact that this nobleman opened many doors and was very well connected for them. And I borrowed one by Stiattesi for the show, because there's this rather wonderful letter where he says, "Our house is full of cardinals and princes. Artemisia doesn't have time to write to you. She doesn't even have time to eat. She's so busy." And I thought that was really evocative of just how in demand she was when she came back to Rome.
How very Artemisia to have her house full of cardinals and princes. There's a question from Francesca Tambling. Her daughter became an artist. Have you seen any of her work, any of Prudencia's work?
Oh, Prudencia, no. So the only reason we know she's an artist is Bullen Rhymes, who's a British diarist, goes to Naples and visits Artemisia twice in her studio. And he records that Artemisia's daughter, Prudencia, is an artist, paints, and also plays the spinet. That's all we know. So we have no pictures known definitely by her, no signed works, nothing. She gets married in the 1630s because Artemisia is trying to get money for a dowry together. But we currently don't have any. I mean, presumably she was trained by her mother, so presumably Artemisia trained her, but we know nothing about her yet.
Yet, exactly. We know that it could happen. It could happen soon. Another question is, where are most of her major works based now?
Difficult question because they're sort of everywhere. The works in the show, I'd say just over half came from Italy. Most of them from museums, but quite a few from private collections as well. I mean, there are only about 30 pictures in the exhibition. I would say there's probably just over double that, which are sort of universally acknowledged to be by Artemisia. And then there's another sort of 60, 70 that sort of oscillate and not sort of, accepted by everyone. I mean, there are quite a few in Italy, obviously, and America, actually, a lot of American museums. There's a lot of pictures still lost, mentioned in inventories. I mean, in London, the only picture we really have is the self-portrait, the allegory of painting, and yet the inventories speak of several pictures. So, I think for an artist also who signs quite frequently, I think there's a lot more out there.
This is also another question. Will the exhibition tour, and why did you decide on the walls being black?
Oh, no, they're not black. How annoying that they look black. No, so will the exhibition tour? No, it really won't, I'm afraid. The intention was always just to have the exhibition here. It would have been far too difficult to negotiate the loans for more than one venue, also at relatively short notice. And then, of course, with COVID in the middle, I mean, I have to be honest, I think it's an absolute miracle that everything that's in the catalogue is actually on the walls downstairs, because it was unbelievably challenging in March to sort of plow on ahead. And we really were right to the last minute hoping to do it. And it just became impossible to get everything from the US and from Italy particularly. And I have to say in September was looking pretty difficult as well, as we were beginning to install, as the situation in Europe was becoming more and more complicated. So, and obviously, as we know, currently the situation is not improving. So, no, thankfully it's not going anywhere else, because it probably wouldn't be able to go anywhere else, even if we planned to.
And it will run till when?
So it runs till the 24th of January. Okay. So I'd been most optimistic, thinking that some people from Europe may have been able to come. I remain optimistic, but it's looking increasingly unlikely. Sorry, what was the other question? The black walls? No, they're not black.
They're dark blue.
And actually, it's one of the things that people have said most, which has been so lovely, is that they're very huey. The last thing I wanted was 50 Shades of Grey. I find Artemisia's pictures are so colorful. She has such a rich color palette. And I really wanted to pull that out. So there's a very rich blue in Florence, and a red, and then actually Naples is deep purple. So that's a real shame it comes across as black in my slide.
Can you show us again? Well,
let me see if it's really coming out as black. Oh, there we go. There's so that's the blue in Florence. It's a very rich, deep, almost kind of slightly indigo blue. And then let me show you. Purple. It's actually more purpley. It looks quite brown there, but it's a very rich purple. I wanted the mood in Naples to be very, very different. The pictures are much larger. The spaces are quite claustrophobic, but I felt that kind of worked to our advantage, because we know Artemisia wasn't happy in Naples. She complained about the kind of chaos of Naples and the violence, and so I quite thought, well, let's use that and make these spaces feel quite oppressive. So I went for a very, very dark color, and the large pictures definitely feel like this sort of towering overview.
Interesting. I have another question here from David Battistella, who's in Florence. Letizia, can you share a personal experience you had reading the letters for the first time? What was the experience like for you?
So I read them in Solinas's book first. I'm Italian, so I read them in the Italian. And I was just so surprised how varied they were. So in some she's very funny, in others she sounds really desperate, very jealous, very insecure. And, I was sort of surprised at just the kind of how rich these letters were in giving you all these sort of different facets of her personality. I mean, I suppose the most surprising, which I did borrow for the show, was this letter that I had to read a number of times where she tells Maringhi, it's obviously a sort of exchange with various letters where she's been sort of accusing him of being with other women. And he's obviously replied saying, no, I haven't been with anyone else. Because she starts her letter saying, well, I'm glad to hear that you haven't, that you've only sort of betrayed me with no other woman and just your right hand, which possesses the thing that I wish I possessed. I read it and thought, she can't mean his right hand? What does she mean by that? And then you carry on reading and she tells him basically not to masturbate in front of her portrait. So she must have left a picture of herself in Florence and she's basically telling him. So it's basically quite, you do actually feel quite uncomfortable reading it because it was clearly only meant to be for his eyes only. But I did choose to borrow that because I felt you get a sense of her passion and her jealousy. And she clearly was very, very passionate generally about things, and the determination with which she speaks about her work and, the passion with which she defends her prices, all of those things. To me, that was quite an important element of her character to come out,
Another question by Siobhan Jolie. What was your reluctance to foreground the rape trial influenced by its absence from her contemporaneous autobiography?
No, and I think you're right in saying foreground, because obviously I wasn't reluctant to talk about it because I think I'm fully aware that most people or a lot of people coming to the show, that may be the only thing they know about Artemisia before they walk through the doors. So it's very important to talk about it sensitively, because it's also a live issue for people today. And, there was a lot of discussion internally about how we would treat that. So I'm very careful with the way I speak about the trial as well. I refer to it as her, defloration, the deflowering of Artemisia, because that really is what Tassi is charged with. The reluctance was not actually about the fact that, yes, as you say, it's not really talked about. It was this fact that I didn't want to completely swing the attention on that. I think there's just been too much attention drawn on that. I mean, in 2011, the exhibition in Milan opened with an unmade bed, with blood streaming down. I mean, it was just, that's absolutely what I wanted to avoid. And I knew the first picture in the room would be her Susanna, and that's such a powerful picture. And I just felt the transcript sort of dealt with it in a very moving and powerful way, but in a very kind of sensitive way as well. I am one of those people who sort of resists in reading her rape in every story, in every painting, and I've sort of, so, the exhibition catalogue as well does not, it does sort of provide a kind of counter argument to that, particularly the Judith beheading Holofernes. I know Mary Garrett also feels the same, that it's just not helpful to read these pictures purely in that lens. I feel very much that when she moved to Florence, it's unimaginable that she would have wanted to paint a picture referring to her rape for Cosimo de' Medici, when she's really trying to move on and she's establishing her reputation, particularly because it was about honor, and she's an honorable woman there. She's married, she's joined the academy, and I feel quite strongly about that, actually.
Well, I mean, but I heard too that it was possible the Florentines weren't aware of her trial. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really talked about. I mean, they were aware because Orazio wrote to Christina of Lorraine during the trial saying, help me, because Tassi's, and he talks about Artemisia. So it was certainly known in Medici circles. But also when she returns to Rome, it's not talked about as something that's hanging over her. I mean, it may have hung over her emotionally, but what I mean is professionally, it was not something she carried with her. I feel quite strongly about that, actually.
Is this a question you get asked often?
No, I get asked it a lot with the Judith. I mean, as everybody does. And, there's no question that, you know, she brings her lived experiences to her work, but then every artist does. And she must have relished this opportunity to paint this kind of role reversal of a woman overpowering a man. But I don't read that, you know, as a self-portrait in the figure of Judith, and I don't read Tassie as Holofernes. You know, we don't know what Tassie looked like, but from a description of him as short, chubby, and with a little beard, I don't think that really rings true with Holofernes, who's sort of powerful. So I just think you have to be slightly careful about reading them just through that. But I think it's quite unhelpful, actually. I don't think it does Artemisia any favors to just read these pictures in that vein.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm just checking to see if you had one word. This is from Anna de Blas. If you had one word to define Artemisia, what would it be? Genius, determination, talent, resistance.
Ambitious.
This is going to keep you up at night.
No, ambitious, because I think ambition is sort of determination. She was ambitious in terms of financial independence. You know, I think her whole life she's riddled with kind of financial difficulty. And she was ambitious for success, both financial but also reputation. Yeah, ambition, I think.
Interesting. I think, Letizia, we're at 1 hour and 6 minutes.
Oh.
It's been wonderful, really,
such a pleasure.
Active on the show. We're so happy that it's being well received, deservedly well received, and I'm particularly happy too that you just chose her first name. I think she needs to be on a first name basis with the world. That's what we hope for.
Well, I feel that she's definitely more a household name now than she was. I think, you know, it's done its bit for British audiences. Yeah. But, thank you.
I mean, I think really I was asking about the gift before. It's hard for you, obviously, to say what your gift was, but I think this recognition among today's art lovers, more widespread recognition and more widespread discussion, because I think really one of the reasons I'm so happy to have had this opportunity with you is how important it is to start talking about these artists and sharing different opinions on how they are perceived and how they were perceived in history, and what type of storyteller they are and how their life relates to ours. I mean, how their stories seep into our own. So
I've been very surprised at, you know, the sort of layperson coming who's not necessarily engaged in art history or hasn't read up about Artemisia. You know, it was interesting when I was writing the labels, just the assumptions I made that people would know that a woman in the 17th century wouldn't have been taught how to read and write, or, you know, that you were essentially the property of your father, and then you know, all these things that you sort of slightly take for granted if you work in kind of on historic subjects, and you have to sort of go back to basics and actually explain that for people, because otherwise they're not going to understand her ambition, or also quite fully appreciate her achievements if you don't understand the base from which she started. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. I mean, I think a lot of times, and also, this is sort of the last thing I'll say, but it's really important. I want to respond to what you're saying here. Oftentimes with restoration, you know, people have the idea, oh, we need to restore the best, the most beautiful, etc. And a lot of times we've had reactions from people saying, well, art by women is inferior, etc. And luckily, by early women, luckily, you know, we're not in the business of deciding whether it's inferior or superior. You know, the whole point is it existed within a context.
Yeah.
The question is why, you know, and if we apply the question why to every single statement that we make, you know, about art by women, because we don't understand really, you know, how many challenges they actually had to face. And so work by Artemisia acquires a whole new value. It's a window onto her reality, you know, her social reality as well, you know. So I can imagine that as someone who studies this, I mean, as your profession, it's difficult to say, wait a minute, people don't know, that they couldn't study the nude, for example, or that they couldn't have access to the academy in the same way that the male members did, etc. We'll have to continue our conversation in the after party, Letizia, because I think we could go on into the morning. But thank you so much.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute delight.
It's really lovely to meet you with all of our friends and supporters around the world. There are so many comments here of congratulations and etc. You can read the comments afterwards, but I'm so happy to have had such a nice turnout and to have such so many questions, and there are other questions, and I apologize if we don't get to every question, but we'll keep track of you. We'll keep track of you. And also a great thanks to the National Gallery as well, Tracy Jones, who I've been in contact with, who heads the press there, etc. Wonderful work, really, hats off to you, to all of you and your whole team, etc. who has worked very hard to give us Artemisia, really. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And thank you
for tuning in, everyone.
Our partners in this restoration conversation.